In the summer of 1945, Japan was unrecognizable, a nation reduced to rubble and silence. Once proud cities were now blackened shells. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had turned into glowing scars on the earth, their air thick with radiation and despair. Tokyo, the heart of the empire, stood like a skeleton of twisted steel, its streets filled with ash, not people. In a small half-collapsed neighborhood on the city's edge, Taro Watanabe, a former factory worker, walked barefoot through the ruins. His hands trembled as he sifted through the debris of what had once been his home. He found nothing, not a photograph, not a memory that had survived the fire. Food was nearly impossible to find. The few markets that remained sold scraps at impossible prices. Inflation had eaten through the yen like fire through paper. One morning, Taro stood in line for 2 hours for a handful of rice, enough to feed his family for just one day. His wife, Aiko, had stopped speaking much. Their son, Kenji, coughed constantly from the dust that filled the air. Across the country, the illusion of invincibility had vanished. For centuries, Japan had seen itself as the unbreakable empire of the East. Now, it had no army, no emperor in power, and no identity beyond defeat. Its industries were gone. Its ships sunk. Millions were homeless. When the American forces arrived under General Douglas MacArthur, the people did not resist. They simply watched, thin, tired, and silent, as foreign soldiers marched through streets once patrolled by the Imperial Army. MacArthur's initial mission was not to rebuild Japan. It was to disarm and neutralize it. The factories that once built planes and tanks were stripped for parts. Entire industries were marked for dismantling. The old economic giants, the zaibatsu, like Mitsubishi and Mitsui, were accused of fueling war and were ordered to be broken apart. In one of those shuttered buildings, Taro's former employer, Mr. Nakamura, gathered the last remaining workers. "We are not soldiers," he said quietly, "but this defeat has taken our tools as if they were weapons." The men said nothing. They knew he was right. Outside, Japan's empire had vanished, replaced by hunger and humiliation. But beneath the ashes, something faint began to stir. Discipline. A quiet resolve to rebuild, not through pride or conquest, but through purpose. Taro would later remember those early months as the time when Japan stopped believing in miracles and started manufacturing them. Winter came harsh and gray in 1947, and Japan was still bleeding from the war that had ended 2 years earlier. Cities were being slowly cleared of rubble, but the economy remained shattered. More than 40% of Japan's urban areas were destroyed. Industry had collapsed to a fraction of its pre-war strength. Factories stood silent, their machines rusting in the cold. In Osaka, Taro Watanabe now worked as a laborer hauling steel scrap from demolished plants. His hands, once trained to assemble precision parts, were now calloused from tearing down the ruins of his own country. At night, he listened to the faint crackle of American radio broadcasts that promised democracy and reform. To Taro, those words meant little. He only wanted bread for his son and work that mattered. At the top of Japan's new administrative structure, General Douglas MacArthur and the Allied occupation forces had taken complete control. Their mission was clear: ensure Japan would never rise as a military power again. To achieve this, they turned their attention not only to weapons but to wealth itself. The great industrial families, the zaibatsu, were dismantled. Companies like Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Mitsui, once the pillars of Japanese capitalism, were broken into fragments. Their leaders were arrested or banned from business. Massive estates were seized, and through land reform, millions of acres were redistributed from landlords to tenant farmers. For the first time in history, the people who had worked the soil would own it. In a small farming village near Kyoto, Hiroshi Tanaka, a quiet tenant farmer, signed a government paper that gave him ownership of the land his ancestors had tilled for generations. He looked at his wife, Sakura, and whispered, "It feels strange to finally own what we were born on." She smiled weakly. Maybe that's what peace means. It was one of the largest redistributions of wealth the modern world had ever seen. But even as Japan began to taste a fragile equality, a new storm gathered beyond its borders. By 1949, the Cold War was no longer an idea, it was a global front. The Soviet Union had expanded into Eastern Europe and was pushing into Asia. In China, Mao Zedong's revolution had declared victory, turning the world's most populous nation communist. Suddenly, Washington looked at Japan not as a defeated enemy but as a strategic shield against the spread of communism. What had begun as a punishment was quietly transforming into a partnership. American policymakers realized something critical. The best defense against communism wasn't occupation, it was prosperity. A strong, capitalist Japan could anchor the Pacific against Soviet influence. And so, in the early 1950s, U.S. strategy shifted dramatically. Reconstruction began in earnest. Factories once marked for demolition were repaired and reopened. Equipment and aid began to flow in from the United States. Economic planners were brought in to guide Japan's rebirth, not as an empire, but as a fortress of capitalism. In Tokyo, new ministries formed, new economists emerged, and new ideas were tested. Among the rising generation of bureaucrats was Kenji Watanabe, now a young man in his 20s, Taro's son. Educated under the post-war system, Kenji found work as a junior clerk in the newly organized Ministry of International Trade and Industry, soon known simply as MITI. He didn't yet realize it, but he had entered the heart of Japan's new revolution, one not fought with weapons or flags, but with policy, planning, and discipline. The streets still carried scars, and people still bowed their heads when foreign soldiers passed. But beneath the ruins, Japan was changing, shifting from punishment to purpose, from surrender to strategy. And within a decade, the very factories that once built instruments of war would become engines of economic resurrection. By the early 1950s, Japan was no longer a battlefield of ruins. It was a laboratory of rebirth. The air still carried the scent of coal and smoke, but now it came from factories humming back to life instead of fires of destruction. Trains rattled again, merchants reopened their shops, and for the first time in years, the people began to speak about the future instead of survival. In a narrow office in Tokyo's government district, Kenji Watanabe sat behind a stack of papers, his glasses fogged by the steam from his tea. He worked at MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, the new brain of Japan's recovery. Around him, dozens of other young bureaucrats scribbled numbers, adjusted forecasts, and debated policies deep into the night. Kenji's supervisor, Takashi Morita, a stern man with a quiet intellect, would often repeat the same phrase. "We are not politicians, Kenji. We are engineers of destiny." MITI's role was revolutionary. It did not command factories. It guided them. The ministry's economists and planners studied the world's markets with surgical precision, identifying which industries could make Japan globally competitive. Then, they funneled resources, loans, and protection toward those sectors: steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, and electronics. The system was later called a guided economy. It was capitalism but with discipline, freedom but with a compass. To the outside world, it looked strange, bureaucrats deciding who should build what, but to Japan, it felt natural. Order was in their DNA. Every yen invested had a purpose. Every machine produced had a destiny. Meanwhile, a new form of industrial organization began to emerge. The keiretsu, networks of companies connected like families. At the center of each was a bank, offering steady financing and coordinating long-term strategy. Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Toyota. These were not merely corporations. They were ecosystems, built on trust, loyalty, and cooperation rather than competition. On a crisp autumn morning, Kenji visited one such company, Hikari Motors, a rising automobile manufacturer. The factory buzzed with rhythmic precision. Workers in blue uniforms moved in silence, adjusting bolts, testing engines, polishing metal. Their supervisor, Daichi Sato, greeted Kenji with a bow. "We don't just build cars here," Sato said, his voice proud. "We build improvement." That word, improvement, soon became a national obsession. Across Japan, a philosophy called Kaizen took root: continuous improvement. The idea was simple but profound. Every process could be refined, every flaw eliminated, every motion perfected. Even a worker tightening screws could find a way to make it faster, smoother, better. On the factory floor, loyalty was sacred. Companies offered lifetime employment, and workers repaid it with devotion. Salaries rose with seniority, not just performance, creating stability and trust. People didn't say, "I work for Hikari Motors." They said, "I belong to Hikari Motors." At night, Kenji would walk home through the neon-lit streets of Shinjuku, where new shops glowed with signs written in both Japanese and English. For the first time in his life, he felt pride. Not the empty pride of empire, but the quiet pride of purpose. Japan's true genius wasn't in copying the West, it was in blending Western innovation with Eastern discipline. While America chased consumption, Japan chased coordination. While Europe debated ideology, Japan perfected efficiency. By the late 1950s, the nation's pulse had changed. Steel mills roared, shipyards gleamed, and assembly lines danced with rhythm. Exports began to flow outward: radios, cameras, and the first compact cars. The same country that once lay in ashes was now building a future of precision, unity, and patience. The miracle wasn't magic. It was method. And every method began with the same belief: that discipline could rebuild anything, even destiny. By the dawn of the 1960s, Japan no longer looked like a defeated nation. The scent of coal smoke had been replaced by the hum of machinery, the sparkle of neon lights, and the rhythm of progress. Streets once filled with rubble now gleamed with department stores, and bullet trains sliced across the country like silver arrows of rebirth. At Hikari Motors, Daiichi Sato walked the factory floor with quiet satisfaction. The company's new model, the Hikari Starline, was rolling off the assembly line, efficient, affordable, and astonishingly reliable. Each car carried not just steel and paint, but a piece of Japan's spirit. "Every mistake is a teacher," Sato would tell his workers. "And every improvement is a victory." By 1964, the year Tokyo hosted the Olympic Games, Japan was ready to show the world that it had risen. The Shinkansen, the bullet train, launched that same year, a symbol of national precision. Crowds cheered as the white and blue train sped through the countryside, faster than any train in the world. Inside government offices, Kenji Watanabe and his colleagues at MITI watched the transformation with quiet pride. They had spent years mapping this growth, pushing industries toward greatness with the patience of gardeners. Japan's exports surged: steel, textiles, electronics, and cars poured into foreign markets. By 1968, Japan had overtaken West Germany to become the world's second-largest economy. Factories expanded endlessly. Salaries rose. Television sets, refrigerators, and washing machines became signs of success in middle-class homes. For the first time, the word future sounded bright. But success has a hidden cost. By the 1980s, the generation that had rebuilt Japan was replaced by one that had never known defeat. Young executives filled skyscrapers in Tokyo's Shinjuku district, wearing tailored suits and drinking imported whiskey. The children of discipline had inherited prosperity, and with it, complacency. Banks lent freely. Corporations borrowed endlessly. Real estate became the new battlefield, and speculation replaced production. Land in Tokyo was bought and sold like gold. One absurd rumor spread that the Imperial Palace grounds were worth more than all of California. In the boardrooms of Hikari Motors, Daiichi Sato's successor, Koji Nakamura, faced pressure to expand. "If we don't buy more land, we'll fall behind," one executive argued. "Growth is good," Nakamura replied, "but growth without reason is danger." Few listened. From 1985 to 1989, the Nikkei stock index quadrupled. Property prices soared beyond reason. Japan seemed unstoppable, the richest, most efficient, most admired economy on earth. The media called it the Japanese miracle, but it was no longer a miracle built on effort. It was a dream inflated by speculation. Then came the reckoning. In 1989, the Bank of Japan finally raised interest rates to curb inflation. Within months, the bubble burst. The Nikkei collapsed. Land values plummeted. Trillions in paper wealth evaporated overnight. Factories slowed. Banks froze credit. Families who had borrowed heavily for homes were trapped in debt. Tokyo's glittering skyline suddenly felt hollow. Kenji Watanabe, now nearing retirement, walked through the same streets where he had once watched Japan's rebirth. Neon signs still shone, but their light felt colder now. "We built a nation of precision," he whispered, "but forgot to design restraint." The miracle had become a warning. The country that had risen from ashes now stood on the edge of illusion. Proof that even the most disciplined machine can overheat when success blinds its engineers. Japan had conquered poverty. Now it would have to confront prosperity itself. The 1990s arrived not with celebration, but with silence. The bubble had burst, and Japan, once the symbol of unstoppable growth, was standing in the fog of its own success. Office towers in Tokyo's financial district glimmered under gray skies, their windows hiding rooms full of quiet panic. Bankers stared at screens showing red numbers. Real estate agents sat in empty offices, waiting for buyers who would never return. At Hikari Motors, production lines slowed. Orders from overseas shrank. Managers spoke in low voices about temporary freezes, but everyone knew what it meant. For the first time in decades, workers feared for their jobs, yet no one dared speak the word layoff. The country that had once redefined discipline now found itself trapped by it. Lifetime employment made it almost impossible to downsize. Bureaucratic decision-making slowed reform. Companies could not evolve, and the government could not admit failure. In the halls of MITI, Kenji Watanabe, now an aging senior advisor, felt the weight of the decades behind him. He had helped design Japan's ascent, but now he saw its limits. One afternoon, he met a young economist, Rei Morimoto, who looked at him with quiet conviction. "Sir," she said, "we built a machine so perfect that it can no longer change." Kenji smiled sadly. "Perfection," he said, "is only another word for stillness." The lost decade stretched longer than anyone expected. Growth stagnated. Prices fell. The economy, once an engine of expansion, became a maze of hesitation. Yet even in the slowdown, Japan did not collapse. While other nations swung between boom and crisis, Japan remained stable. High employment, low inequality, world-class infrastructure. Its citizens were still among the healthiest, safest, and most educated in the world. The streets were clean, the trains ran on time, and crime was nearly non-existent. The system had slowed, but it had not broken. By the early 2000s, a new generation of leaders began to emerge. Young thinkers who had not lived through the war but had inherited its lessons. People like Rei Morimoto started to question the old model. "Discipline built our miracle," she said in a speech at Tokyo University. "But evolution will define our survival." She was right. The same traits that had rebuilt Japan, restraint, order, and precision, had also become its limits. The world around it had changed. Technology, globalization, and innovation now demanded flexibility over control. Meanwhile, across the East China Sea, China was adopting Japan's own playbook: state-guided capitalism, export dominance, infrastructure expansion, and debt-fueled growth. The pattern was familiar, almost prophetic. Kenji, now retired, watched these changes from his small apartment overlooking the Sumida River. He would rise early, drink green tea, and read the news quietly. He saw headlines about new bubbles, new crises, and nations repeating the same story Japan had lived through. He often whispered to himself, "They think it's about money." It was never about money. Japan's real miracle had not been its factories or its exports. It had been its mindset, the belief that discipline, unity, and patience could rebuild a nation from nothing. But even miracles must evolve. In the end, Japan's story became more than an economic tale. It became a mirror for the world, showing how nations rise through sacrifice, falter through success, and endure through wisdom. The paradox of perfection is this: the more flawless a system becomes, the less room it has to grow. And as Kenji looked out across the quiet Tokyo skyline, the same city that had once been rubble, he finally understood what his father Taro had seen decades ago among the ashes. "Miracles aren't given," he whispered. "They're built, one choice, one discipline, one generation at a time."